Aperture Priority, show number 16, all about filters.
Welcome to the Aperture Priority Podcast, an Avila Studios production where it's all about photography and fun. Now open up that aperture and let some creative light in.
Hello and welcome back to show number 16 of Aperture Priority. Tony Avila here, and again with me today I have Mr. Joe Engelbert.
Hey, Tony, good morning. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. Been a while. A bit of frustrations with WordPress.
Well, you know, that old adage, technology is wonderful when it works.
And the frustration for me, I get this warning, you have to take out these infected files, but you don't know what infected files to take out.
That sounds serious.
So, and this is what happens when you change themes. When you get rid of an old theme, it doesn't get rid of everything.
I see.
And so this is just, I'm going to have to make a decision in the future whether to change hosting or to even change platforms. There's Squarespace. I know you're on Wix.
Right.
So I may have to look at that in the future.
You know, it's a never going evolution because what's the top 5 last year is the bottom 5. I mean, it's a ongoing competitive world.
And of course, everybody wants the simplest way to host, to post. And I'm going to have to look into that because when it takes 2 weeks of going back and forth, and now, of course, the problem is the place I'm hosting, their technical support is overseas. So I was getting some people in the Philippines. And when you call, you hear this room of chatter and you're trying to understand them. So it was a bit of frustration, but overall, I took a bit of a break. I did do a couple of shoots, getting back into the grind of everything. Haven't been paying as much attention as this new equipment as it's been coming out. Nikon did come out with a couple of new lenses for their Z line.
The 2470, the Holy Grail, yes, it finally did.
And the 14 to 30 f4, which wants me to revisit travel lenses because that to me is a perfect range. And what I've seen of it, it does get, again, for f4, if you're going to be doing scenics and things, you're going to want a little bit more depth of field. And it has in-body image stabilization. So what I've seen results of, it looks pretty interesting.
Well, I've been working hard at several big projects. I've been doing a lot of writing and doing some teaching and tutoring and training and that type of thing. Enjoying that very much, going on photo shoots that are a lot of fun, but also instructive. You and I went on a photo shoot with a couple of other guys here a week or so ago, went to Yosemite. And what is this, mid-April? This podcast we went mid-April, you and I. Got there before daybreak, which is a very early morning for us.
Yes.
Departure time at 3 a.m. And got there before daybreak. Took some great shots, and one of the guys, the reason we went is one of the guys, Felix, really wanted to shoot the waterfalls because there's a lot of water. They're really big and booming and beautiful. And he wanted to take an ND filter and really feather them out and look nice. And we did that, which leads us to today's show, by the way. And one of the questions he asked is a great question. Besides taking pictures of waterfalls, what else is there good for using creative use of an ND filter? And so, you know, we were talking about it, and filters in general would be a great topic. So that's the topic of the day later on here.
Yeah, all about filters. I used to have an arsenal of filters. Going back to the film and every days where
the black and white filters, you know, the red, the yellow,
the red, the yellow. Yeah. And then if you were shooting an event, you would get the what was it? The FD filter to correct fluorescent lighting. Where now a lot of things have been corrected by, setting your white balance.
Exactly, in the digital world.
But I still I still use filters. Of course, I will use protected UV filters.
So we're talking about the filters that go on the front of your lens.
Front of the lens. And where many people, and I know many of my friends do not, and they say, well, it's just another piece of glass. And you can go why you should or shouldn't. But why I choose to use these protective filters, because a lot of my lenses that I use now are no longer in production. And when you go hiking in the back, I do take hiking boots, but I can't remember which ankle it is now. But years ago, when I was younger, playing soccer with my cousins, I kind of tweaked an ankle that's never been the same. So I have to watch it when I'm out hiking, because it'll want to give out on me. And when you're carrying around your tripod with your camera on it, if it goes crashing down and that front element hits, well, guess what? That lens, I'm going to have to try to find another copy of it. I'm not going to be able to get it repaired. So I stick to using the protective filters. It's just an insurance policy for me.
Well, that makes sense too. I think those are labeled UV haze filters, and they're neither. Well, they're imperceptible. And, purists would say, don't put another piece of glass on the front of your lens. However, it is a great insurance policy, and I don't think that I can perceive a difference. They certainly don't cut the haze, but that's how they're advertised. But that's one of the biggest fallacies in filters is UV haze. Woo.
UV haze, yeah. The only thing I will say, if you do put a protective filter on it, get good glass.
That's where it really counts, because going back to your scenario where you have an older lens that's irreplaceable, how much is it worth? Well, or if you have you've invested a couple $1,000s in a high-end lens, how much is that worth? Well, it's worth whatever you paid for it, right?
Right.
So it doesn't make sense to put a $20 filter on the front of it. In fact, an interesting story. A friend of mine bought one of those, bought a lens, and it came with it was a kit. It came with a carrying case, and it came with these filters and everything. And he already had some UV filters in that size, so he gave me the one that came with it. And it happened to be an odd size, and I didn't happen to have that particular size, but I did have a lens that I had just purchased that needed that size. So I screwed it on the front of it and went out and shot all day and came back in the evening. And every one of those shots was soft. That piece of glass was the problem. I took the glass off. In fact, I freaked out. What did I have? A focus issue? So I shot it without the UV filter, and it was, tack sharp. Put it on there, same focus, everything, and it softened it. I said, man, I have a softening filter on the front of my lens, not a UV, so I got rid of that thing.
Yes, and one thing I would caution, I know many of us now do all our purchasing on eBay. Be careful. Get a good brand. Hoya has a good brand. I think it's HMC. You don't need the very, very top end, but they make a good brand of filter.
So let's talk about filter quality before we get into the specifics of the filters. Which one's Hoya is your favorite?
I've used Hoya. I've used Heliopan. I've used B&W.
Yeah.
Those are the three main, or Nikon.
Those are the four right there.
Right there. And I've had good luck with them. Why I say be cautious, because sometimes on eBay, you may look like, oh, there's a Hoya. That's one of their good ones, and you'll purchase it. Mm-hmm. Pay attention where it's coming from, because it may be a copy.
A counterfeit.
And right. So you're thinking you're getting a great price on a Hoya, and actually you're getting a counterfeit.
Right.
And it could be just a plain piece of glass or who knows what it is. It could be, who knows, even plastic. And you're putting it on your lens, and you're not doing yourself.
No, in fact, like my experience here, actually degrading the image to the point where they're no longer usable. The point is you get what you pay for.
Exactly.
And I would be slightly hesitant to buy filters on eBay only because, in the scheme of photography, they're fairly inexpensive unless you're buying 30 or 40 of them. But there's a solution to that we'll talk about in a second. However, if you're paying $80 to $100 for a 77 millimeter filter, you're buying a pretty good, pretty good quality. That means you're probably buying a Hoya. Now there's a Tiffin.
There's Tiffin,
and that's sort of a consumer entry level type of filter, and they're fine, but you get what you pay for.
Exactly. The German ones, are they worth it? Years ago, I used to shoot Contax camera, so it had Zeiss lenses. So I figure, well, it's a German camera. I'll put a German filter on it because what I could tell you, my experience shooting with Zeiss lenses, both in the Contax and then I had a Hasselblad, they were just, I can't explain, everything about those lenses were wonderful. Mm-hmm. But they were very expensive. So you might as well, if I went and forked out a lot of money, it's like, well, give us some justice. Because if I'm going to get a cheaper thing on it, I'm better off than leaving
it off, right? And take your chances. If you're going to take advantage of the optical qualities of the lens to its fullest, yes. So I actually own several Nikon lenses, filters, but they can be used for any brand of camera, of course. They're the same size filter. You can screw them on anything that has that same size thread. But they're often overlooked as a high-quality filter, so consider those as well.
Yes. Like I said, those brands are good. Then something to consider, you could get your UV filter if you want, or take this into mind. What's the biggest filter size that you use on one of your lenses?
That would probably be 80 or 90 millimeter.
90 millimeter.
Yeah.
So something to think about. Instead of buying, every, like a polarizer filter for every size, that could get very, very expensive. Mm-hmm. What I do, I will use a step-up ring. Mm-hmm. So, and I've got all these adapters. I've had them for years. And for me right now, the biggest filters for the lenses I use is 77. Mm-hmm. So I'll just buy everything 77. Like right before Christmas, I bought, it was Breakthrough Photography UV filters. So I came down to the choices like go 77, but then they have an 82, and I'm trying to think of the future.
Right.
Now your 24 to 72.8 seem to be coming with an 82 millimeter thread.
Nikon, it certainly does.
Yeah, and I believe Canon does too. And it's almost like 82 is the new 77. So,
well, what are you to do? I mean, we have friends that have suitcases full of different sizes of filters, like a coin collector. It looks like a coin collection in there. One solution is to go back to the thing I used to do in the film days, is the Koken filter holders, and just buy the 100 millimeter by 100 millimeter square filters, and they fit anything. There's some there's some pros and cons to that. Polarized filters are different.
They're very different. But I'm glad you brought that up, because at the time that I was looking to get these filters, and the reason I got Breakthrough Photography, their filters, there's no color cast when you're doing, these are ND filters. So I have three types. I have the 10 stop, the 6 stop, and I believe theirs is a 4 stop. It's not a 3 stop. And those are usually the ranges you will find. Mm-hmm. If somebody tells you there's a 20 stop one, beware.
Without stacking them, yes. And we were kidding each other is that
Right.
I have an ND 1000, which is a 10 stops. So I said, okay, the last liar wins here. I have a 1000 stop filter. It says so right on it, but that's a 10 stop.
Yes. And so when I was looking at this, I almost got the square ones. I stopped. I kind of regret that now, because what's nice about those drop-in square ones, it doesn't matter. All you do is get the mounting system and the adapter to your filter thread. And what's nice, you can just drop them in as you need them. And I'm going to tell you a story why this is important. Also, dropping them in, you could get the gradiated ones, and those are the ones that I'm eventually going to get to where I'm out doing a seascape. And sometimes here in the central coast of California, it's hit and miss in the summertime. It's 110 degrees down here in the valley. You go to the coast, it's 60 degrees overcast. And then when the sun comes up, it's so bright in the sky. That's where that filter, of course, you could shoot a bunch of exposures and then go in and do your photo merge and do HDR.
Sure.
But I kind of sometimes like just toning down that, because the sky, when you're out the coast, it is just bright. It's really bright.
And that brings us to the question of, when do you use these filters? What are they designed for? And the graduated filter that you just mentioned that's a perfect example. Is when you have a bright sky and a foreground that's darker, standing on tunnel view, a very iconic spot in Yosemite Valley, looking out over the beauty and the majesty of Yosemite Valley with El Capitan on your left, Bridal Veil Falls, and in the distant background, Half Dome. And then further on, you can even see the white clad mountains in the far distance. If you're not using some kind of balancing methodology, whether it's multiple exposures with bracketing or a graduated filter, you often get really overexposed skies. I've seen a lot of photographers that just buy the glass and they carefully transport it around, and then they use it and just hold it, fist and hold it, and they move it up and down so that graduation is even more blurry and blended in. You and I had an interesting conversation with a photographer once that uses a whole different technique, by the way. He was an older guy that came over, and he was asking us questions, obviously from Asia somewhere, probably China, I suspect.
I think it was China, yes.
And he was asking us about our technique and just questioning, and sounded like a complete newbie. And then he pulled out his phone and started showing us his photographs, and absolutely gorgeous photos. And he was showing us a picture he'd taken the previous evening from that same location. And he demonstrated for us his technique was simply to hold his hand in front of his lens and on the upper half of his sky and move it rapidly up and down during a 1 or 2 or 3 second exposure, because he would create a long exposure and then use his hand to block the lights. Like I thought, like dodging or burning in a dark room. And I'm thinking,
that's
sometimes we get so technically and gadget oriented that we just forget about using the things that we have, like our hand, to do that. So I was amused by that particular demonstration.
That was. And the one nice thing about using those square ones, you can drop and stack them. Mm-hmm. They'll have slits. And why I said earlier, why I wanted to bring this up, right before Christmas, I had a client in Santa Maria here in California, and I went to go take her photos to her. She bought one of my images from the gallery I was showing, and I did some canvas prints of her daughter. So I went to go deliver them. I figured I'm going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I just got these ND filters, and I'm going to go out there, and it's called Montana d'Oro. And I set my camera on a tripod. I was right there at the edge of the cliff, and I was getting the nice blurry ocean because I'm slowing it down.
Right.
I noticed, because, I would go in there, set my focus, and then put on the filter because the tin stop gets really dark.
Right.
It's hard to focus.
Yeah, you can't focus after you, yeah.
Yeah. What caught my attention was I was doing this, and I was like, go to the front of the camera, put on the filter. Then I looked off, and I'm like, I'm right on the edge of the cliff.
You're a little close to the edge, eh?
And I started thinking, if I had the drop-in filter, I stayed behind my camera, I drop in the filter, because sometimes I get caught up too much, and I'm like, I think my friend Johnny kind of pointed that out to me. He was with me that day. He's like, you're awfully close to that edge, and he's been with me before where I've been too close to an edge of a cliff. So I was like,
Well, Tony, I don't want to read about you being one of those photographers that gets absent-minded and falls off a cliff.
I know.
Which has happened with alarming frequency in California lately.
Yes. So I started thinking, I think a good solution for me would be to get that system. And there's Koken, there's Lee filters, there's one called Format High Tech, there's Breakthrough Photography. They make their own. I like their filters. I don't know about their mounting system because they all take 100 millimeter filters. So it's finding the right adapter that'll work from you.
Right.
There's one I want to bring up. I found this system. It looks great. I know it's good quality, but the price is out there. It's called Wine Country Camera. I'll put a link on the show notes.
That can't be bad.
That
can't be all bad.
It's not all bad.
I know a photographer right off the bat that would go there just because of the name of
It's just the cost of it. But,
yeah.
But the quality is there, and how they built this thing. They built it so your filter will never accidentally drop all the way down, because basically you have a clamp that you slide in your filter, and then it presses inward, and that holds your filter. Mm-hmm. And sometimes photographers will loosen up, and your piece of glass will just fall right to the ground.
And if you're on a cliff, it goes a long ways.
It goes a long ways. So they've kind of built a really cool system. So as I'm looking at this, it's because now I just want to have a little filter pack when I go out with
right.
me. I do not want to take a suitcase of filters.
I don't blame you. Well, we don't want to take a suitcase of anything with us. I have found a little filter holder that fits on my belt, and I use that, and I put 4 or 5 of my screw-in type filters, and it's adequate, and it works for me. But I'm with you with the different, the increasingly varying sizes of lenses. I'm beginning to reconsider my filter strategy and maybe go back to because I used to use Kokens in the studio all the day in and day out. But now, it was just the convenience. They are inconvenient. You have to be. They're fragile.
They are fragile,
and the polarizers are different to use.
They are different. Yes,
they take it. It's a new learning curve to use those properly. So there's some cons to that, and they're not cheap, by the way. They're certainly not.
They're not, and that's why when I bought these Breakthrough Photography ones, there was on a special on them. I saved, I think, $8. But their high quality filter, they were like $180 around there.
I see.
And there's what I could say about neutral density filters: get the good quality because there's no color cast.
Right.
Now, there's one thing that would advise when you shoot a long exposure, your eyepiece, there's usually a little lever you switch.
Right.
Turn off the light.
Right. Make sure you do that.
Yeah, because if not, your light's going to seep in through, especially if the sun's behind you.
Right. So most high-end cameras have a built-in little switch. You can just flip it over and it covers the eyepiece. Piece of tape, your thumb, whatever you need to do, cover that eyepiece.
Just remember to do it, because I feel kind of dumb, because right before I went there, I asked Joe because I was using a Nikon D800, and I was trying to get familiar with it, and he showed me where it was.
Yeah.
So what did I do when I get to the coast? I don't use it. And then I remembered, oh yeah, that's why we need to use it.
That's why
because the sun was so bright behind me. So basically, I've kind of just narrowed down my filter selection to just a protective filter and ND filters and a polarizer.
That's all I carry.
And eventually the gradiated ND filter.
Right.
And I'm very happy with that.
And you can do a lot with that. So let's talk about some creative uses. And that was the question. How do you, besides shooting waterfalls, and you mentioned ocean, what are some creative uses of using both the polarizer and the neutral density? So I sat down and wrote an article about ways to use the ND filter in creative ways. And I came up with 14 different ideas. So I'm going to run those by you. We can talk about it. We've already mentioned two of them. Obviously, shooting waterfalls, and that really feathers the water. And that's a technique that we're going to use on other examples of creative uses. So that's the first thing, waterfalls. And so people ask me, what are the techniques there? You don't need a 30-second exposure for a waterfall to make it look feathery, and you need something that exceeds or is longer than a quarter of a second, half a second. A couple seconds will do it. Even half a second will give you that look. So bracket your shutter speeds until you get the look you want. And so to use the ND filter, and under any circumstances, you want to compose your image, your focus, and then take a test shot. Make sure it's composed the way you want it. Focus where you want the focus, and make sure your f-stop is where you need it. And then put everything on manual focus, manual aperture, manual everything. Screw on the filter, and then using a remote shutter or a timer, if you don't have one, take the photograph, because you can't focus, you can't see and you've already covered up your eyepiece. Live view doesn't work because there's not enough light coming in from the lens. So that's the basic premise. So let's go through that, and you can comment. The first one is shooting waterfalls. Talked about that. Here's one though. If you're in a daylight situation, you're shooting a scene, and you wish you could get a better bokeh in the background, screwing on a 4-stop will allow you to open your aperture, and you could really have a nice blurry background. Mm-hmm. Well, otherwise, there's just no way. You don't have a fast enough shutter speed to open that shutter or that aperture. So that's an obvious example of why we use ND filters, is to create that blurry background in bright light.
Yeah, especially here in the valley.
Right. Specifically, if I'm shooting, let's say I'm shooting a wildflower, and it's in a field of flowers, but I want to focus on one flower, and it's a bright, slightly overcast day. I can't get enough shutter speed usually to give me the type of wide open aperture I want. So a ND filter will bring out a nice blurry background on that wildflower. Another way to use it is that an ND filter in a way will help balance a high contrast scenes, because it'll knock out the highlights and give you a better chance of getting an overall image balance. So if you have a really, really bright sunny day, you can screw on an ND filter and knock out the bright by 50% or so, and then compensate on the low end or on the shadows there. So that's another thing. You already mentioned, another thing that is really useful to use an ND filter is when you're shooting running water, and make that silky smooth. You and I were doing that in Yosemite, by the Pohono Bridge there, where the Merced River flows underneath it there. There's a beautiful curve. And if you have a lot of rapids, and it's like miniature waterfalls, same drill, but it gives a very silky, smooth finish to it. And that's true of another use of it is to, like you were doing, to smooth out the waves in the ocean. And that creates, you can really get a foggy, misty look if you set that up at ground level, not on a cliff, but at ground level, on the shore and the waves are coming in, and you put a 2 or 3 minute bulb exposure, long exposure on it, you'll make that water look like, because of the repeated wave motions, the camera will repeat the highs of each of those waves and diminishing strengths, and it'll look like mist. And it looks like a giant mist is enveloped. And you've seen the famous shots of the piers going out in the water, and then the misty looking water. Well, that's how they do it with a 10-stop ND filter.
And it also creates that look at the clouds in the sky.
And that's the next thing, is that if you're standing again looking at a landscape and you have clouds, creating that nice streak, that streaky cloud look in the daytime, it really can add some punch to your iconic shots. One thing we talk about in our photography club is going back to tunnel view. We've all shot tunnel view. It's an iconic view, and how do we make it different? There's 1 billion photographs of that view floating around, and probably 1 billion more will be created by the end of this year. And I don't exaggerate much, but how do we make it different? Well, shooting with an ND filter, creating that blurry sky, that feathery waterfall, all in the same image with an ND filter. Great use of an ND filter.
Yes.
You can also control your lighting with an ND filter, if it's getting just the brightness of an outdoor scene. If the conditions are changing, you just get more you get more f-stop control, because you can, by varying your ND filters from a 2 to 4, 6, 10, whatever, and you can stack them to make different numbers in between. And you could stack 2 10s and have a 20, the hypothetical 20 that we were inventing yesterday. Then it just gives you a lot more control of your aperture. So again, it goes back to controlling the aperture. Here's another one. At sunset, sunset, you have these varying shades of color that are displayed as the sun goes through the spectrum of light as it gets lower and lower, and there's more and more atmosphere absorbing the rays of light, and going from the indigos down to the reds, and then finally, the oranges and what have you. Putting on a 2-stop ND filter, you can get some colors that are kind of in between those colors, because it blends them together, creating an effect that you wouldn't normally see on a sunset. So that's an interesting approach, and you might think of that. And here's something I've done. We've all been to famous tourist places like shooting the recently the Notre Dame had its horrible fire, but standing there in front of that world famous tourist attraction, there's hundreds of people in the shot. You could put on a neutral density filter and take a 30 or a 40 or a 2-minute exposure, properly exposed, and those people are out of the frame. Yes. They've turned into ghosts because they move. Mm-hmm. So you can remove people from in front of your object. I did that at Pike's place, the market up there in Seattle. Mm-hmm. Bright sunny day, thousands of people, couldn't even see the front of the. So I sat my tripod up, put a 10 ND filter in front of that, and put a 2-minute exposure, and they disappeared. It was spooky. At nighttime, I've used a 2-stop filter to shoot fireworks, because fireworks are so bright. And I've been able to tone them down with shooting fireworks. And then two more, and jump in here if you can think of any more. Sometimes we look at a scene, and let's go back to a landscape, and there are trees in the foreground, and there's a little bit of a breeze, and they're moving ever so slightly, and we do everything we can to make them absolutely tack sharp. So we go to a high shutter speed and everything. But what if we took advantage of the natural movement of plants, such as trees, and we took a really long exposure of the trees as they move slightly? You get a really, sometimes you can get a really interesting effect of something that you don't see with your eye. I use this technique with wildflowers. If you shoot wildflowers, there's one thing you're always fighting, and it's the wind.
Yes.
Wildflowers evidently can't grow in places that don't have a lot of wind. So it doesn't matter. You have a breeze, and they're so delicate and fragile that they bob around. So after I've shot the image of the wildflower in the early morning when it's nice and stable, I will just take advantage of that wind, moving that flower head, moving back and forth by using an ND filter, long exposure, get a nice smear of color with a sharper image where it comes to rest in between the gusts of wind. So it's a really interesting technique, but that's then the creative use of ND filters. There you go, 14, I think.
14. Oh, that's good. I'm going to piggyback on what you said in the very first one, the bokeh. If you're a portrait photographer and if you're out somewhere, if you're not using a flash and you want to use the natural light and you don't want that bright background without having to stop down, there you go.
There you go. Exactly.
And here in the late summer, even right now to the late summer where we live, that's a perfect way to use the ND filter. And then while we're talking about landscapes, this the question came up when I took that shot from earlier this year in late January. We were right there at looking at the view from the tunnel in Yosemite, and I used a 10-stop, and then I switched to a 6-stop ND filter. And this is right before the sun was coming down when we got that orange coming across. And a couple of guys in the group asked me, why in the world would you use an ND filter? It was a 30-second exposure. And that 30 seconds, I was getting that slight blur of what water, there was already water coming off the falls. And then the subtle movement of the clouds created this depth, almost like a layered effect, because the mountains are still.
Right. Well, we are in California. They're mostly still, right?
They're mostly still. We're still that day.
Yes.
And you're right about how the colors blend.
Yeah.
Because that really popped out that sky that day that we had. It was, I don't know if there was rain the day before. I can't remember if there was rain that morning when we went there. We were hoping for snow. But as we got the clouds, as the sun's that color, and it was one of the last shots because as the sun's setting, you have that only little window right before that color just goes. And I just wanted to take the most of it and take that 30-second shot. And I knew after that, I only had one more shot and it was already gone.
Yeah. Well, that was an outstanding, I know the image you're talking about, an outstanding image. So polarized filters really quick. Here's a technique that I use a lot is that when a circular polarized filter is you rotate the filter until you get the effect you want. Sometimes, though, you have to choose between the sky and the foreground as to the effect. Well, why not just do both? Shoot both of them. One by rotating the lens, the filter for the sky, and a subsequent shot for rotating the filter for the foreground, and then merge them. And use the same technique with the polarized filter. So that's a use that a little tip about using polarized filters. We could talk a lot about polarized filters, but real quickly, they're absolutely useless if the sun is in front of you or behind you. It has to be over your right shoulder or left shoulder.
Yeah, okay. I've always used them to cut down reflections.
Another great, on water or shiny objects, absolutely.
Let's say if I was taking a portrait of somebody where I'll put one on, let's say they're in front of glass or something. You rotate it till you see the reflections off of the glass.
Right, and that's a good use for them.
Yeah, so those are little things that I've used them. But sadly, I hardly ever pull mine out anymore. I basically use the ND filters, and that's about it. I don't even pull out. Every once in a while, I'll test out the old orange, yellow, red, green for black and white.
Right.
I ran into an interesting issue. You know how on PC it's Alt, on the Mac it's the Option key, how your how you could, when you're in Camera Raw and you adjust and you could see where your highlights start to blow
Your
out.
whites, your blacks, your highlights, right?
When I used an orange filter, it will not work.
Really?
Because you just do it and it just stays the same. It's like, And I got some interesting tones with it, but I got, Then I started thinking, well, okay, that was fun to try once. I go back in the box.
Got to experiment, right?
Experiment.
Sure.
And it's, now I look at it, do I really need it? No, I really don't need to take those. So it's less weight to take on a trip.
I'm all for that.
There you go. That was a good conversation on filters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I learned a lot.
Yeah. And again, the best way is to go out and experiment. If you see somebody use it, try it, say, well, if we use it, how can I use this for me?
Right.
And just take them out, put them out and use it.
All right.
So Joe, where can we find you?
Well, this article is on a blog on brightangelimages.com, brightangelimages.com, where you can contact me there, or with Instagram at bright_angelimages for the Instagram. On Facebook, it's Bright Angel Images at Facebook. So those are some areas that you can contact me.
Great. You could find me, of course, here on the AvilaStudios.com. I keep forgetting we're also on iTunes, and I'm going to try to expand more on that. I also going to try to expand more on other platforms, but I may try to set up a Patreon because some of the other platforms they charge, where Apple doesn't. Mm-hmm. And some of the charges, they vary, like a $30 a month thing. That's quite a bit. So I'm going to try to expand more on other platforms. Then Tony Avila 64 on Instagram. You could find me, of course, the Aperture Priority page on Facebook, and I'll have a link to that. And I'm hoping to keep growing this community, and I'm gonna try to tame the gremlins where we could do more productive things than trying to sit there and yelling at WordPress. So as we move forward, I'm hoping that I'll tame them and grow this to. I like to grow this to a bigger community.
Oh, that'd be great. All right.
So let's leave off with to open up that aperture and let that creative light in.
Aperture Priority is an Avila Studios production. For more information on what Avila Studios has to offer, please visit us on the World Wide Web at avilastudios.com.